that Presidential Medal of Freedom because when I got it, a homeboy texted me and said, "Hey, I heard you got some presidential pardon or something." Something like that. Thank you, Bishop Kevin, and thank you, RJ, and my Jesuit brothers here. And I want to add my voice as well to so grateful to see Matt and Rose here, my friends from Annunciation. Thank you for being here tonight. Way in Los Angeles, of course, and other places in this country, we stand with you. So it's been the privilege of my life for 40 years to have walked with gang members. And the day won't ever come when I have more courage, or I am more noble, or I'm closer to God than the thousands and thousands of men and women who have walked through Homeboy in all these years. People like Hector, who was 15 years old, a gang member, he was an elementary school dropout, sold drugs and violent. And he stopped and he started to work at Homeboy. And he started to inhabit his truth and his goodness. And he was sitting in front of my desk and he was trying his hand at small talk. And he said, "Oh, by the way, I ran into a man who attended one of your talks once." I said, "Really?" He goes, "Yes. He found your talk rather monotonous." I said, "Oh my gosh, he did?" He goes, "Well, no, actually that didn't happen, but I need practice using bigger words." So I asked him kindly to practice on somebody else. Well, I've been in this church before, and it's a great community, and moments like this and an evening like this reminds you of what Martin Luther King used to say about church. It's not the place you've come to, it's the place you go from. And you go from here tonight, eventually, to nurture into being a community of kinship such that God might recognize it. You go from here and you imagine a circle of compassion, and then you imagine nobody standing outside that circle. And indeed, you'll go from here to decide to dismantle the barriers that exclude, because that's who you are. And you want to take seriously what Jesus took seriously. And you go from here and you stand at the margins, because that's the only way they will ever get erased, is if we stand out at them. And you stand with a particularity, you stand with the poor and the voiceless and the powerless. And you get to stand with those whose dignity has been denied and those whose burdens are more than they can bear. Every once in a while, you get this exquisite privilege to be able to stand with the easily despised and the readily left out. You will get to stand with the demonized so that the demonizing will stop, and with the disposable so that the day will come when we stop throwing people away. And you will go from here, and you already know, especially those involved in the Ignatian Volunteer Corps, that you're going to have to brace yourself for people who will accuse you of wasting your time at the margins. But the prophet Jeremiah writes, "For in this place of which you say it is a waste, there will be heard again the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voices of those who sing." You'll go from here, and other voices will get heard because of you. And I think that describes what the Ignatian Volunteer Corps is all about. Of course, none of that makes any damn sense at all if it's not anchored in a sense of God that's spacious and expansive, in the God who loves us without measure and without regret. We've settled for a partial God, and it's gotten us into trouble. Meister Eckhart, a theologian and a mystic, used to say, it is a lie any talk of God that doesn't comfort you. And we're all raised in such a way that we only believe that in a partial way. Because we've created God in our own image, and that gets us in trouble. My friend Ann Lamott says, you know you've created God in your own image when God hates the same people you do. So we want to avoid that. And, so you want to go for the spacious, because otherwise our God becomes too puny, and the container is too small. And Ignatius of Loyola talks about the God who's always greater. Just when you think you've landed on the best way to describe this notion of God, it's even greater than that. I remember many years ago I had a spiritual director who said, we need a better God than the one we have. He was a Jesuit. But of course he was right, because we've settled and we don't want to. Richard Rohr says that it's true enough that we are created in the image and likeness of God, but it's also true that our image of God creates us. And so we want to break out of that as best we can. Mirabai Starr, who's a mystic and a translator of mystics, and I recommend her books, she says, once you know the God of love, you fire all the other gods, which greatly describes what the whole maturing process in spirituality is really about. It's about firing all the other gods. Many years ago, for 40 years, I've been saying Mass in detention facilities, on a rotating basis, and we have lots of detention facilities, juvenile halls, jails, probation camps. And I was celebrating Mass in San Fernando Juvenile Hall, and it had about 200 gang members in the room. And I was up on a raised platform, and I had my album on and my stole. And then there was an ambo over here, and the homies would come up and they'd do the readings. And they had this sheet that had the readings in English and in Spanish so you could follow along. And I had the sheet resting on my lap, and I thought, I'm going to close my eyes and hear the word proclaimed. And the first guy got up and read from the Hebrew Bible, and the second guy got up to do the responsorial psalm. And I don't know, there was an overabundance of confidence in his voice. And he gets up and he says, the Lord is exhausted. And I looked at the sheet, I said, what the hell? And it was, the Lord is exalted. And I remember thinking at the time, wow, that's way better. Because the exalted God is, the God of our own projection. Because if we were God, we would want to be exalted. But the exhausted God, you can connect to it. I mean, I see enough white hairs in this room right now that, somebody might see you on a Monday, and how was your weekend? Oh my God, I pooped. I had the grandkids the whole weekend. But it's a good tired. You know how people say that. But it's about generosity and giving of yourself, and it's other-centered, and it's loving-centered, and the exhausted God is pretty good, I think. One of the great inventions of COVID was Zoom, and I have 5 sisters and 2 brothers, and once a month now, ever since COVID, we go on Zoom. And the last time we were on, it was my mom's birthday, and she would have been 100 years old. She died at 92. My father had died 30 years before. And she died the way everybody wants to die, in your own bed, in your own home, surrounded by your kids and your grandchildren. And she was sharp as a tack, even to the very end. In fact, in the last year of her life, she watched so much MSNBC, she was becoming Rachel Maddow. And she wasn't a lick afraid of dying. In fact, a month before she died, she was just giddy. She was just exhilarated. And she said, "I've never done this before," which is something you would say just before skydiving. And in fact, the day before she died, I was sitting at the foot of her bed, and I was all alone in her room, which never, ever happened. You always had a bunch of people in there. It was just the 2 of us. She was asleep. And she opened her eyes and she saw me sitting there, and she said, "Oh, for crying out loud." And she went back to sleep. She was pissed she hadn't died. I'm sorry. And then the next day, I was sitting there again at the foot of her bed. This time it was exactly noon. Again, very odd. Nobody else was there. A couple of my sisters went out to get lunch or something. And at exactly noon, she opens her eyes and she lifts her head from the pillow. And she lets out this wondrous, glorious gasp. Skydiving. And she left us. And no one in earshot of that sound could ever be afraid of death again. And I remember in the last weeks of her life, she'd be in and out of consciousness, and there'd be 3 of her kids, 5 of her kids, all 8 of her kids, a whole bunch of grandkids. And she'd be in and out, and then when she came to, she'd lock on to just one. And she'd look at this one person with laser beam focus, and with breathless delight, she'd say, "You're here. You're here." And I remembered that when we buried her, I thought, I think that may be the singular agenda item of our exhausted God, is to look at you with breathless delight and say, "You're here. You're here." In fact, we have this notion of Jesus 40 days and 40 nights in the desert. We have this notion of this. And of course, that's the precursor for our Lent. And I can't ever mention the word Lent without telling you about a homegirl named Michelle Nunez, a tough cookie, grew up in the projects. And she came into my office one day and she goes, "Well, it's official. I just found out my man's been cheating on me." I said, "Oh my gosh, I'm sorry to hear that." "Oh, I don't sweat it. I just went to church, got me them ashes, gave his ass up for Lent." That has nothing to do with what I'm trying to talk about. But I'm like Pavlov's dog. If I say the word Lent, I'm going to have to tell you about yourself. But I digress. And so there's Jesus, 40 days, 40 nights. We have this notion, dark night of the soul, agony, grumbling stomach, doubt. When I suspect all it was God looking at this guy and saying with breathless delight, "You're here. You're here." And so we receive the tender glance, and then we choose to be the tender glance in the world. We notice the notice of God, and then we choose to be that notice in the world. We choose to stand at the margins, and we want to be in the world who God is: compassionate, loving, kind. I have a homie who I call my spiritual director. His name is Sergio, and we email each other every morning. We have for many, many, many years. He's a gang member. He worked at Homeboy. Now he runs a food pantry in Pomona. And every morning we read the readings for the day, and then we email whoever gets up first, and we're both up in the 3 to 4 range. And we email kind of just brief reflections, stuff that stood out from the readings. And just a couple weeks ago, he had ended an email to me, and he said, "So today I will surrender into the arms of God, then choose to be those arms." That's the entire law in the prophets. It just doesn't get better than that or clearer. You receive the tender glance in order that you can be that tender glance in the world. Amen. That's the hope. So as Steve mentioned, Homeboy was started a long time ago. During the time I was pastor of a very poor parish, nestled in the middle of 2 public housing projects, Pico Gardens and Elisa Village. At the time, it comprised the largest grouping of public housing west of the Mississippi. We had 8 gangs at war with each other, which is unheard of in public housing, to have that many. LAPD called my parish the place of the highest concentration of gang activity in the whole city. So if LA was the gang capital of the world, my parish was the gang capital of Los Angeles. I buried my first young person, killed because of this sadness in 1988. And 3 months ago, I buried my 263rd young person. Not all from that parish, of course, but I know a lot of gang members that get asked to do this. So the first thing we did was we started a school, because there were so many middle school, junior high age gang members who had gotten the boot from their home school. Nobody wanted them. And so they were wreaking havoc in the projects in the middle of the day. They were writing on the walls, they were selling drugs, they were violent. So I walked out to them, and I'd isolate them one at a time, and I'd say, "Hey, if I found a school that would take you, would you go?" And to my surprise, each one said, "Yes, I would." And then I couldn't find a school that would take them, so I forced my hand. So across the street from the church is our elementary school, Dolores Mission Parochial School. And grades K to 8 occupied the first 2 floors of this concrete 3-story building. The entire 3rd floor was the convent where the sisters lived. And so one night I gathered the nuns in the living room. There were about 8 of them. And I sat them down and I said, "Hey, would you guys mind, moving out? And we can turn the convent into a school for gang members." And they looked at each other and they said, "Sure." That was the entirety of the discernment process. So we were off and running, and many gang members came from all 8 gangs, which meant 3 times a day we'd have huge knockdown brawls. I'd have to run across the street to calm it down. But they came to the school. This whole thing created a kind of a disconnect in the parish, because parishioners would sidle up to me and they'd say, "Aren't churches supposed to be hermetically sealed? Good people in and bad people out?" And so that was a good gospel challenge. But it was a tough place. Teachers didn't last long. I had a principal who lasted exactly 1 day. I called him the next morning to find out where the hell he was, and he had changed his phone number. And apparently he had checked into a witness protection program. But they came. And they started to say if only we had jobs. So myself and the women in the parish, and the profile of the projects are women and children. There weren't a lot of men. So myself and the women, we marched around the factories, surrounding the projects, trying to find felony-friendly employers, and that wasn't so forthcoming. So we just had to start stuff: a maintenance crew, a landscaping crew, a crew to build our child care center, all made up of members of the rival 8 gangs in the projects. Then on the last day of April in 1992, after the acquittal of the 4 police officers who beat down Rodney King, every pocket of poverty in Los Angeles erupted, except the poorest pocket, my parish. And so the LA Times wanted to know why that was, because we were kind of the most likely to erupt. And I said, well, I'm not entirely sure, but part of it was, I think, the fact that we have 60 strategically hired rival enemy gang members who have a reason to get up in the morning and a reason not to gangbang the night before. And more to the point of your question, a reason not to torch their own community. So the next day the article appeared. Well, the following day I was summoned to the Beverly Hills office of a movie producer named Ray Stark, who happened to have $500 million. And he opened by saying, how should I spend my money? And I can see now that I woefully undershot my request. I was young, I had hair. I said, well, there's an abandoned bakery across the street from our school. You could buy it. It has ovens. They don't work, but you can fix them. And we could put hair nets on rival gang members, and they could bake bread. We could call it Homeboy Bakery. And he said, sure. And so we were off and running again, and then a month later we started Homeboy Tortillas in the Grand Central Market. Once we had plural, a bakery and a tortilla factory, we changed our name from Jobs for a Future to Homeboy Industries. And now 10,000 gang members walk through our doors every single year wanting to reimagine their lives. Every single one comes barricaded behind a wall of shame and disgrace, and the only thing that can scale that wall is tenderness. Every single one comes with what psychologists would call a disorganized attachment. Mom was either frightened or frightening. And you can't calm yourself down if you've never been soothed. Each one walks through our doors and they hope to be safe. And they want to be seen so that they can be cherished. Each one walks through the door and they're greeted by gang members just like them. Greeted by people whose whole being seems to say, you're here, you're here. You receive the tender glance, and they hope to be that tender glance. If it's true that the traumatized are likely to cause trauma, then it has to be equally true that the cherished will be able to find their way to the joy there is in cherishing themselves and others. And there was a homie I knew named Danny, and in the old days I would ride my big old black beach cruiser through the projects, and I would patrol all 8 gangs, sometimes several times a night, sort of take their temperature. And I would see this kid Danny, he was like 13 years old. Every time I rolled up on my bike, he was with the older homies. He always made a point to lift his shirt to show that he had a gun tucked into the front of his pants. I don't know why he wanted me to know this. And he made a solemn vow once. He said, I will never step foot in Homeboy Industries. So I only knew him from the streets, and I knew him from juvenile hall, and I knew him from probation camp. And finally, at 18, he goes to prison just for 2 years. And gang recovery, like drugs and alcohol recovery, they say it takes what it takes. For gang members, it's the birth of a son, the death of a friend, a long stretch in prison. For Danny, he got out after 2 years, 20 years old now. And to discover that his mother had 6 months to live, she had pancreatic cancer. And Danny had a lot of siblings, but somehow he ended up being the hospice caregiver. And I would go over to his house and I watched him with his mom, and he was so tender, which was all the more remarkable because she had been torturous towards him. And I anointed her once, and then like a week later she died. A week after that, I buried her. And a week after that, Danny walks into Homeboy Industries for the first time. And I watch him inhabit the truth of who he is, that he is exactly what God had in mind when God made him. I watch him, as the homies say, laugh from the stomach. And I watch him get his GED and work side by side with guys I know he used to shoot at, because I remember. One day he comes into my office and he sits down and he begins very dramatically. What happened to me yesterday has never happened to me in my life. And he proceeds to tell me after work at 5, he goes across the street to the Chinatown stop, the train, and he takes the train going east to go home. And he says the train is packed, but he manages to get a seat. And standing right in front of him, holding onto a pole, he says he's a medio pedal guy. The guy is a little bit drunk. He's a gang member, he says. He's an older lot, but I don't know who he is. He has tattoos on his hand. And Danny's wearing a sweatshirt that says, Homeboy Industries, jobs, not jails. And the little bit drunk guy looks at Danny in the sweatshirt and goes, you work there. And Danny doesn't know whether he should fully engage this guy, so he just nods. And the guy said, is it any good? And Danny shrugs and he says, well, it's helped me. In fact, I don't think I'm going to go back to prison because of this place. And then Danny stands and he carefully removes a piece of paper from his pocket and a pen, and he starts to write the address of Homeboy Industries. And as he's telling me the story, he says, I couldn't believe I knew the address by heart. And he finishes it, and he looks at the guy and he sees him. And he hands the paper to him and he says, you come see us. We'll help you. And the guy sees Danny and he says, thank you. And the train stops and the guy gets off. Now Danny, in the telling of the story, returns to that dramatic refrain. What happened to me next has never happened to me in my life. Everyone on the train was staring at me. Everyone on the train was nodding at me. Everyone on the train was smiling at me. And now he can barely speak. And for the first time in my life,